The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
As investigative historian A.E. Saman wrote, the only population communism has ever successfully fed is the shark population swimming in the Florida Straits. With protests in Cuba over the repressive regime and inevitable shortages of goods, all eyes are cast south, wondering whether the last 60 years of suffering is at an end for the US neighbor, and on a broader scale, if the oh-so-sticky idea that socialist and communist governments can last in a time of unprecedented freedoms is really valid. Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides, and on this week's edition, we'll be examining why the role of socialist and communist governments face a Sisyphean task, always having to double down and keep pushing that rock, as the inherent problems with such systems entail their very downfall. We'll also be speaking with economics guru Andrew Moran to discover why, when a government controls the economy and the means of production, these belabored nations just can't seem to make ends meet. Also on today's show, we'll be discussing the history, the present conditions, the protests, and of course the future for the Cuban people. How long will the citizens last against this regime? Is this a real Cuban spring? What help will the US government provide, if any? And why so many self-avowed democratic socialists in American government are keeping tight-lipped on the evolving situation? LibertyNation.com is a proud sponsor of the Liberty Nation radio show. Check out LibertyNation.com for all your conservatarian needs, original news and articles, videos, podcasts, LN Radio, and their signature TV program, The Conservative Five, all on LibertyNation.com. Conservative news, where truth matters. For more than 6 decades, the people of Cuba have been living a life of shortages, of oppression, and of one disaster after another. Desperate souls have boarded unstable rafts, risking their lives to head 90 miles north to the United States of America. And yet notable voices in American politics have blamed the US for the current predicament. Not to be outdone, a fast-dissolving narrative in the Fourth Estate attempted to paint the recent protests as a response to coronavirus. So what's the truth behind these present chaotic scenes? To help us unravel the conflicting narratives, we're joined by Liberty Nation's editor-in-chief, Leesa K. Donner. Welcome, Leesa. Thanks for being here.
Hi, Mark.
Now, in your opinion, which of these stories is correct? Are the Cuban people responding to COVID, American sanctions, or the communist government?
Actually, I think it was, can I choose none of the above?
Absolutely.
I think it, and there is some evidence to suggest that it was a music video that inspired the uprising in Cuba. It's called Patria y Vida, which means homeland and life.
Homeland and life. That's direct contradiction of the homeland or death, which is so commonly used in communist countries. Is that right?
Exactly. And it's fascinating that the video begins with a picture of longtime Cuban hero, and you might want to know, poet and martyr Jose Marti. Yeah. And Jose Marti is on the face of a coin, and the coin burns away to reveal the picture of George Washington. So nowhere in the video do they talk about COVID. There were a few lyrics that I jotted down for you. Would you like to hear them?
I'd love to, please, yes.
No more lies. My people ask for freedom, not more doctrine. It's over. Your time has expired. The silence has been broken. So the establishment media, I watched some of the coverage, it was totally appalling. Protesting, quote, shortages of the COVID vaccine, food and gas. Hello, these people are crying for freedom. I think to reduce their cause to a shortage of commodities is to miss the essence of the Cuban people's message, Mark.
I think so too, yeah. I mean, it's not as though for the last 62 years, I believe it is. They haven't had food shortages. It's almost, unless you're a rich foreigner on a junket paid for by a political party in the United States, not naming names, it seems that your food is always in short supply. So, I mean, it's difficult for many to equate right now what's happening in Cuba, not to equate it with the Arab Spring movements that we witnessed just a few short years ago. Is this the case, or is it a flash in the pan that will eventually just subside into the next semi-revolt? And where does the evidence point on this?
Well, I thought it was quite interesting that today the announcement was made by the Diaz-Canel communist government. The travelers to Cuba will now be permitted to bring as much food and medicine as they want without paying duty. So scrapping the import duties is kind of a double-edged sword for a communist government because it signals to the protesters that they at least got something out of their uprising. In other words, will people en masse see it as worth it and try it again? I don't see this as a status-changing event for Cubans, but the struggle for freedom and liberty, as we know, Mark, is eternal.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the major aspects here, and this is something that very much applies in both your country and mine in terms of internet censorship, which we've seen so much of over the last few years. And the Cuban authorities, they shut down large parts of the internet, presumably for one of two reasons. One, to stop people organizing, and two, to avoid the international, let's call it access or oversight that comes with all the videos that we see and the photos that we see. And now you've got politicians, namely Senator Marco Rubio, for one, who wants America to grant satellite access for internet to the island, essentially bypassing the regime. Do you think that's going to happen or not?
Well, I don't know, but satellite capabilities would be nice. But frankly, Mark, I think some guns in the hands of Cuban freedom fighters would come in handy this week. Of course, the U.S. has tried that before with a disastrous result. But honestly, I don't see the internet as the end all and the be all, especially against a hardcore communist regime as Cuba. No, what they need are arms. That was actually Batista's downfall. Yes. Though he put Castro in prison for a while, he never managed to get the guns out of the hands of the revolutionaries. I remember one man liberated from a communist country, and he said to me, first they took away our guns, and then they put us all in jail.
That is a story that has been told how many times? It's almost axiomatic with these communist and socialist countries. First, they take away the guns, then come the prisons. It's like a roadmap that we should be seeing, that everybody should be aware of. But it seems that so many in politics are trying to change the map and say, this doesn't happen. We can protect you.
Well, I think that's why people in the United States are so, serious about the Second Amendment.
Absolutely. I mean, also, there's a lot of things that America has to offer the entire world. It's the only country that has a written constitution that guarantees your right to free speech. That doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. That guarantees your right to bear arms for protection, both against anything that anybody who may choose to cause you harm, but also and specifically a government that goes for tyrannical overreach. These are unique things, and we see this. We've seen the pictures in Cuba of people waving the stars and stripes, and we saw it in Hong Kong too. They were waving the stars and stripes. This is that flag represents so much, even though we have so many people in the United States who wish to denigrate the flag or turn their back on the flag. To the rest of the world, it means the world to the rest of the world. Do you think that America today, with what's happening, still represents the values inherent in that flag?
Well, the U.S. is an inspiration for sure. Unfortunately, this Cuban uprising landed during a time when the Democrats are in power. I think if Trump were in the Oval Office, U.S. reaction might be a bit different.
I reckon so, yeah. I mean, I'm fascinated by Alejandro Mayorkas, the Department of Homeland Security head, who told the Cubans in no uncertain terms that they must not come to America. Why, when it seems to be, it's open borders for literally everybody else. Do you think that he's making this distinction? I mean, on the one hand, the Biden administration appears to be encouraging folks who face, let's call it just economic stress, that this is the new barrier to pass, that you're facing economic stress. But they're denying those who are actual, genuine refugees and asylum seekers. It makes a mockery of the asylum system, especially by the commonly accepted international standard, right?
Well, with all due respect, Mayorkas is an idiot. I mean, first of all, open borders don't help the people of Cuba. It's very difficult to overthrow communism while locked on an island. The topography of Cuba is not their friend, and it's always been a stumbling block. Where's it to go except for shark-infested waters? Even though it's only 90 miles away, it's a treacherous journey where many have perished.
Leesa K. Donna, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Mark.
And we'll be right back after this short break.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
Now, we all watch the world and wonder how well communist and socialist countries are getting on. But our intent in this nation watching varies greatly. For those who disagree with the whole concept of big government and a sizable state footprint, we wonder how long such regimes can last, and whether the toppling of such governments will be peaceful, and how the historical inevitability will be played out. Will it be a coup, an uprising, or a general collapse, as we saw with the former Soviet Union? For those who support such ideologies, they watch and hope that these nations will be success stories that can be used as demonstrable proof that such policies could work for the good of their own people in their home countries. Now, not to conflate the two ideologies, socialism and communism, it's worth looking at the difference between them. According to Karl Marx, who literally wrote the book on the subject, socialism is a stepping stone to communism, and is one that sees ownership and control of industries and the apparatus vested in the collective of citizens, administered by the state, whereas communism bypasses the collective control and just hands it all straight over to the government. There are only 5 countries today that are considered communist: China, North Korea, Laos, Vietnam, and of course Cuba. One of the many things all these countries have in common is super strict immigration laws. As in, if you want to live there without being on a sponsored work visa, you're pretty much out of luck. While some far-left politicians in America praise these nations, they rarely address the strict immigration regulations that are so often pilloried by the same. As for socialist countries, well, there are very few that operate as strictly socialist. Many of them allow private ownership and businesses. And in fact, here's the key to why many of them are still going. The free market models that so many socialists and, in America, democratic socialists rail against are actually what support the burgeoning state bills. Economist Ludwig von Mises, he wrote in the 1920s that every step that takes us away from private ownership of the means of production and from the use of money also takes us away from rational economics. His point being that when everything is centrally planned and owned by the state, goods and machinery, they have no market value. So how can planners decide what has more value? As host emeritus of Liberty Nation Radio, Tim Donner often points out, one-step thinking is at the heart of these far-left fantasies. The power brokers decide on a course of action to deal with an imminent problem. And then they need to make another drastic change to deal with the inevitable fallout of those changes. And then yet another major shift to deal with the consequences of their latest maneuver. Like Sisyphus rolling his rock up the hill forever, it seems that this short-term thinking only ever leads to more of the same old, same old. Ronald Reagan once opined, how do you tell a communist? Well, it's someone who reads Marx and Lenin. And how do you tell an anti-communist? It's someone who understands Marx and Lenin. And as ever, the Gipper was right. We've seen communist nations so prideful and defiant fall one after the other. Those few that remain are seen as examples of how freedoms must be eroded to serve the greater good. Just look at Cuba. Protests began and hundreds are arrested. The internet is shut down, and President Miguel Diaz-Canel calls on revolutionary citizens to take to the streets to fight the protesters. And of course, there's North Korea, possibly the most regulated state in existence, where an unkind word about the dear leader can lead to imprisonment or worse for you and your family. Or what of China? That although it regards itself as communist with Chinese characteristics, it does allow private ownerships of sorts. You can have a business, you can buy property. But the cost of these added freedoms is a crackdown on civil liberties. Cameras record your every public move. A social credit system is in place that forbids travel, employment, and bank services if you happen to have gone against the government narrative. And let's not even get started on the political prisons that are so rife among these types of countries. While China may be an economic powerhouse, that has come at a price. When America's democratic socialist politicians try to sell the idea of socialism, it should be remembered, as Marx stated, that socialism has only ever been a stepping stone towards communism. It's notable that many of those who identify as democratic socialists are remaining silent on the issue of the Cuban protests, almost as if they hope it will just disappear. Naturally, the Fourth Estate is willing to let this slide and refuses to question those who have been so supportive of the island nation in the past on the present situation. In fact, Department of Homeland Security head Alejandro Mayorkas had this to say to the Cubans who are seeking to flee their country. He said, quote, "Allow me to be clear. If you take to the sea, you will not come to the United States. Again, I repeat, do not risk your life attempting to enter the United States illegally. You will not come to the United States." End quote. So here's the deal according to the government. You can cross the southern border illegally by the hundreds of thousands from any country on the face of the earth across the southern border. Agents will pick you up, they'll process you, and the cities and the taxpayers, of course, will fund your healthcare, your family reunification, education, and spend millions giving you the rights that this country affords, even going so far as to reach out and send flight tickets to people who were refused asylum or refugee status under President Trump, and expanding the refugee and asylum procedures to include those who only face economic hardship. But, if you want to leave an actual repressive regime that sends revolutionaries against you for protesting, don't even think about trying to come here. That's the message. But why? Could it be that having already lived in a communist country, these newcomers would have no interest in becoming eventual voters for a government that even smacks of socialism? Is that too jaded? That the benefits and freedoms afforded in America are refused to those who would vote to continue them? As Karl Marx himself wrote in the Communist Manifesto, quote, "It's high time that communists should openly, in the face of the whole world, publish their views, their aims, their tendencies, and meet this nursery tale of the spectre of communism with a manifesto of the party itself." End quote. But the proto-communists in America dare not. For if they understand one thing only, it's that the American people value, above all things, freedom. And sadly, for the people of the world who live under this spectre of communism, freedom and this particular ideology are mutually exclusive.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear for your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio on the Radio America Network. Well, we've heard all the stories and the arguments from America's democratic socialists on why and how a form of socialism could work just fine in the United States, despite all historic evidence to the contrary. To delve into the economic falsehoods and foibles, we're joined by economics guru and Liberty Nation writer, Andrew Moran. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Andrew, with the recent events in Cuba, it's noticeable that certain members of the Democratic Party, specifically those who identify as democratic socialists, are remaining very, very quiet, almost as though they were naughty children who've been found with their hands in the proverbial cookie jar. Now, tell me, Andrew, is there a noticeable difference between what these self-proclaimed democratic socialists are calling for and what actually happens in the countries that are, in practice, socialist?
Well, everything that the democratic socialists want is what Cuba has: free healthcare, free cradle-to-grave education, a government that embraces currency devaluation that generate a modicum of economic growth, which is, comparable to the modern monetary theory, or MMT, that many of the radical leftists are championing. The chief problem with America's socialists is that they promise endless fruit without even discussing if it's rotten. It's all positive without any of the consequences. And what you're seeing in Cuba for all these years is that rotten fruit, but leftists don't want to eat it. They don't want to move down there. They don't want to embrace it. They don't want to live through it. They just think it's a socialist paradise, like they thought Venezuela was for after all these years. And of course, you also see the authoritarian tendencies of these socialist governments. In 2008, for example, Cuba introduced a private property measure inside of their constitution. Sounds great on the surface. When we dive deeper into it, policymakers still have control over regulation of what you can do on that land, what can be produced in that land. So it's comparable to these democratic socialists who claim that they still support private property, but at the same time they complain about how housing is commodified and real estate shouldn't be investment. So this democratic socialists in Cuba, they want quasi private property. So it's really talking out of both sides of your mouth with the democratic socialists in the United States and the socialists in Cuba.
Two sides of the same coin by the looks of it, Andrew. So from an economic standpoint, what issues is Cuba facing right now? And perhaps more importantly, do they have the mechanisms in place with their constitution, their legal structures within the ideology to fix them? Or will they have to break out of the ideology, much as China did, to more embrace a free market method?
Do you have a Cuban cigar? Because we can go on all day for what's wrong with Cuba. You have food shortages from the rampant price controls and the assault on private property. You have price inflation that's spiked around 900%. You have the peso that has been devalued by 1/4 this year. You have the lack of medical supplies. The healthcare infrastructure is dilapidated. I recently wrote about this. So just to put this into perspective, there's an outbreak of scabies going on. But the medical providers don't have antibiotics and the topical medicines that treat it. It's exactly what's happening in Venezuela. It's remarkable to see it. Now, do they have mechanisms? Not really. Most of the country's food had been imported. The country, once again, the price controls, and the president said that he will not remove them. So private property is still a joke. A lot of the left will say, okay, well, the trade embargo is a significant issue of what's going on in Cuba. But from all the reports I've read, a lot of the entrepreneurs in Cuba say that it's the government's policies that are contributing far more to the destitution unfolding in Cuba than it is, the trade embargo that was heightened under the previous U.S. administration.
It's funny that we often hear the Cuban health service lauded, and yet they have an outbreak of scabies that they're unable to deal with. You'd imagine if the population were as well educated I'm not saying they're not well educated, but if they were educated and had the ability and the opportunity to actually create antibiotics, you'd imagine they'd do it, especially as this is not a recent problem for them. Now, let's dig a little deeper into what the historical record tells us about countries that operate under these types of systems. Can you give me the Cliff Notes version, please?
So I remember a couple of years ago, the late, great Robert Wenzel he was the editor and publisher of the Economic Policy Journal. He was asked, if you remove the price controls in Venezuela, would there be relief? And he said, almost immediately. So it shows that a lot of these hallmark socialist policies that are so destructive in many of these countries, Argentina, Venezuela, Lebanon, Colombia, Zimbabwe, All these socialist countries employ the exact same policies and have the exact same results. It's pretty telling how all of these socialist mechanisms are destructive. If I may, I would like to paraphrase the legendary economist Milton Friedman. He would say that the socialists may not know much, but they know how to produce a shortage or a surplus. And Nicolas Maduro, the new president of Cuba, the Lebanese prime minister, all these people are going for the same Marxist playbook, not seeing any change whatsoever.
Let's jump quickly into that about price controls. How does that work? It's not literally just the government saying bread must be sold for X per loaf. Or is it?
No. That's what the government does. The government does put those maximum prices on all their products. So in Cuba, they have the price controls on a lot of their foods, and therefore, people can't really produce much because they can't turn a profit from producing those goods. Venezuela had the same thing, whether it's flour, bread, cornstarch, whatever the case. These manufacturers couldn't produce anything because they couldn't turn. If it cost them $1. If they were ordered to sell a loaf of bread for $1, but it cost them $1.10, then they can't do anything. They're going to lose money. So why bother manufacturing anything? Same thing happened under the Nixon administration. Nixon administration imposed price controls on milk in the 1970s, and what happened? You had a shortage of milk because of the exact same economic incentives. It's all basic economics, and for some reason, every country, at the very least, every left-leaning country, they abandon basic economic doctrine.
Yeah. Now, a lot of countries, as you mentioned, like my home country as well, the United Kingdom, we have politicians who say that all of the things that we like, whether we like them or not, such as the National Health Service, things like this, that they are socialist concepts in practice. Now, the reality is that the budget for the National Health Service in the UK has doubled in the past year. And it just seems to be a monster that insists on being fed. Now, Cuba has a similar health service with all operators being government run. Now, when politicians, they espouse this type of thinking, are they being disingenuous? Are they lying to just further the socialist cause? Because it seems to me that without the free market support structures footing the bill for these health services, these national health services, we just couldn't afford the burden.
Yeah, I refer to it as creeping socialism. You have the ratchet effect where you have one socialist program, and then in order to cure the failures of that socialist program, you impose even more socialism to somehow provide a modicum of relief. But as you said, it's comical when all these leftists they say there should be no billionaires. But who do you think pay for things like the National Health Service or all these other big government progressive programs in the United States, Canada, England, whatever the case? In the United States, if you comb through all the U.S. IRS data, it's a top 5% of income earners that pay most of the country's tax bills. So you're right. This guy claims that these programs save money. They're monsters that need to be routinely fed. The problem with all of these programs is they start small and then they metastasize, they balloon. And before you know it, they grow and grow and grow and require new taxes to pay for all of these projects. And it never ends. It's comparable to every tax proposal. Every politician says, okay, we need this new tax just to pay for this. It's just going to be 0.25%. But then as time goes by, it expands 0.5%. And it keeps building. And in socialism, once a policy fails, leaders think, okay, I can solve this with another government boondoggle that's going to mask the problem of the first one. And it just everything becomes more destructive and it ruins everything. Before you know it, the whole country's in ruins.
The Sisyphean efforts of tax collectors, right?
Yes.
Now, the final question for you, Andrew. What do you predict for the Cuban economy and, more importantly, the Cuban people going forward? Are there any bright lights on the horizon?
Well, I'm generally a skeptic, so I'm going to say no, there isn't a light on the horizon. I'm usually cynical of uprising, mainly because a lot of these anti-government demonstrations, whether it's in Latin America, Africa, Asia, whatever the case, they're not free market uprisings. They still want government control of somewhat. It's just there's no difference about it. What happened in the aftermath of the Arab Spring? Not much. What happened during the protests in Venezuela last year? Not too much, except more empanadas for Nicolas Maduro. I'm especially cynical if there's any evidence whatsoever of neoconservatives being involved. So far, I haven't delved too much into it. So who knows if neocons have any footprints in the Cuban demonstrations going on. I will say that I'm pretty sure the Cuban government is very grateful that that Atlantic storm is brewing that could hit landfall in Cuba soon. So that could either postpone the inevitable, or that could wipe out the demonstrators, whatever. And so I think you just need to give it time. The events unfolding in Cuba are still relatively young, so things could change in the next month. I hope it will lead to something good. Hope it will lead to a different regime or more of a free market oriented economy. But I'm doubtful.
One follow-up question here, Andrew, for me.
Yes.
You use the term free market a lot, which is really what capitalism is. And I think that the term capitalist itself was invented by enemies of free markets. Correct?
Yes.
Now
it was invented by Karl Marx.
Yep. Now there was a poll that you discussed on a recent Liberty Nation television with Jeff Charles, where I'm not sure of the figures here, but it was the younger generations were very much against capitalism. Is that correct? What were the numbers there?
Yeah, so from my recollection, it was a slim majority. I think it was 54% of young Americans were in favor of socialism and 49% were against capitalism.
Now, that particular poll, was it presented as, do you favor or disfavor capitalism? Using the word capitalism.
There were two different questions. It was what is your view on capitalism and what is your view on socialism? Do you have a favorable or disfavorable view of capitalism, and you have a favorable or disfavorable view of socialism?
I want to thank Andrew Moran for being here with the Economic Insight, and we'll be right back after this short break.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
One of the hallmarks of a communist regime is that although votes are allowed, there's only ever one party choice on the ballot. When Cuba attempted to deal with rising frustrations with the Castro regime, a front man was put in place, President Manuel Diaz-Canel. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. The people are denied the right to choose their representatives in any realistic or meaningful way. And of course, that comes with voting restrictions and laws, a situation that many say is being echoed in the United States. As President Joe Biden declares the efforts of Republican-led states to enforce or add new voting laws as Jim Crow 2.0. Is this merely a useful catchphrase to obfuscate actual reform? Or is he in some ways right? To help us unravel this election entropy, we're joined by podcaster and author Jeff Charles. Welcome, Jeff.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Well, first, let's start with a little background. What are the voting laws that are being so demonized by the political left? And are they as bad as the characters on Capitol Hill are actually making out?
Yeah, well, what's interesting about these laws is that, when they're talking about Jim Crow 2.0 and all that, all the other crap that they talk about, they're talking about laws and measures that already exist in many blue-leaning states, in democratically run states. So, we're talking about things like voter ID. That's always been a source of contention over the past few decades, although they have in recent years kind of backed off of that a little bit, maybe because they realized that the lies that they were telling about voter ID weren't working.
What are those lies, by the way, Jeff?
Sorry, Jeff. Well, yeah, they say that, voter IDs will disproportionately prevent Black Americans from voting because the Democrats are essentially arguing that Black people are not able to get photo IDs to use when they go to vote, which is false. What you'll notice about a lot of these arguments, Mark, whether it's voter ID or other voting laws, is that they will always claim that it disproportionately affects the Black community, but they never provide data or proof to back up their claim. The data is actually the opposite. And in fact, the overwhelming majority of Black voters support voter ID laws. So the evidence just isn't there. And I think that more and more people started to realize that it was all a farce to begin with. But some of the other measures were just reversing laws that were put in place during the pandemic to make it easier for people to vote and not, catch the coronavirus. So we're talking about things like drive-through voting. They're getting rid of that. We haven't always had drive-through voting, especially here in Texas, but they allowed it because of the pandemic. Other issues have to do with partisan poll watchers and vote counters and things like that. But most of these measures are just reversing what was done under the pandemic because we're coming out of the pandemic. So that's really what's going on here. And the Democrats are counting on people to not know that and pretending that it's racially motivated.
So if my original premise here was correct, that many of these laws are already in place anyway, or as you correctly point out, they were, let's call it wartime laws in a Godfather reference of there's no time for a wartime consigliere here. What is the outrage about? Is it manufactured outrage, or is it that the people who are against these new reforms are seeing it more as it's going in the wrong direction?
The outrage is 1,000% manufactured. Again, the Democrats are trying to play on the ignorance of a lot of people when it comes to these issues, and they're banking on that to push their agenda. I think the problem that they're having, though, is that even if people say more moderates in the center or moderate Democrats, even if they're not fans of these voting laws, I mean, I have some issues with them too. They're not being persuaded by the idea that this somehow impacts the Black community more than others. They may have other issues with the laws, but really the Democrats are using the wrong line of attack because they're so race obsessed and they're so used to making everything about race that they're promoting a narrative that pretty much everybody knows isn't true, including the people promoting the narrative. So it's not going to benefit them as much as they might think. Well, really, the only people that they are convincing are people who already believe it in the first place, or the people who already want to believe it. They're not convincing anybody outside of that.
Preaching to the choir. So in your opinion, when Joe Biden says that these new laws are Jim Crow 2.0, and it's great, I mean, it rhymes, so that's all that really counts for political substance nowadays. But is he right, wrong, or merely hyperbolic?
He is manipulative. And he is essentially glomming onto the narrative that the left is promoting. See, here's the thing about the Democrats. They show over and over again that they don't care about the Black community, and they don't even respect us. They don't even respect the Black community because they're conjuring images of Jim Crow. They're using what we call Black trauma to manipulate people into thinking that we're being victimized here. And the idea that this is Jim Crow 2.0 is absurd, and everybody knows it, but they do it anyway. Like you heard the recent story of these Texas Democratic lawmakers fleeing to the Capitol. What did they do when they got there? They went and sang off key. They sang a song called We Shall Overcome, which is an iconic song that comes from the civil rights movement. I sang it in school when I was younger. So they have no problem exploiting imagery and concepts from the civil rights era and pretending like they're relevant in this instance today.
I heard that sing-along that they had, and it seemed to me that they were singing numerous different songs that all just happened to have the exact same words. It was really a bizarre experience, almost psychedelic, watching the discomfort on their faces. Now, Jeff, you've written a lot about how the outreach to Black voters from both the left and the right has been fraught with errors and in many ways patronizing efforts. Care to elaborate?
Yeah, sure. I mean, on the left, and the left is in a different position because they don't have to be as effective with their messaging because they already have the Black vote, because they don't have competition. But they do things like, if you remember, during the George Floyd controversy, the Democrats in the House were kneeling in the Capitol building wearing kente cloths. They do a lot of stuff that is cringe even to Black people who vote Democrat. So they're not always in the know when it comes to what the Black community wants. But at the local level, they do a very good job. They just don't do a good job at actually governing. However, on the right, we don't give them any competition. We in most cases, we don't even campaign or run candidates at the local level in cities like Chicago or Baltimore or other areas with high Black populations. And on top of that, if you look at the conservative movement and a lot of conservative media and certain personalities, the message that they have about the Black community is demeaning, it's deceptive, it relies a lot on stereotypes, and it's not really even designed for a Black audience. So, the left doesn't have to do much with their messaging because they know that they don't have any real competition from the right.
Jeff Charles, thank you very much. And that's all we have time for on this week's Liberty Nation Radio. I want to thank our guests, Leesa K. Donner, Jeff Charles, and Andrew Moran. And most of all, I want to thank you, the listener. Thanks for being here. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. As ever, I wish you the very best in your constant pursuit of liberty, freedom, and happiness.